Hi there, and welcome to another edition of Israel Explained. Today we're going to talk about what else? The Israeli attack on Iran that occurred last night, part of a cycle of attacks and counterattacks between Israel and Iran. The real question now is this the last attack or will there be more? Spoiler alert, I'm pretty sure there are going to be more, although not necessarily in direct response to this attack, since Israel has given Iran a little bit of a window of deniability. But let's first talk a little bit about how the operation went and what it means. So it's been 3 weeks since the Iranian attack on Israel, the missile attack that this was in response to, an attack that was basically a failure. Um, it was more successful than Israel let on because I did see satellite images of two Israeli air bases sustaining damage, but not serious damage. So ultimately, it was a failure of an attack. But Israel decided to respond in a way that would maintain the advantage for Israel and would be somewhat disproportionate. But as we know, there was a major argument over what components would be in this attack, whether there would be attacks on the nuclear program or not, and whether there would be attacks on the oil refineries or not. As we saw in many publications before the attack came, ultimately the decision was to only go after Iranian military targets, and in particular, targets that have to do with the missile attacks on Israel, which makes it very relatively proportionate and therefore, at least theoretically, not particularly escalatory. Now, the attack started last night, uh, 2 a.m. Israel time, and continued to 7 a.m. Israel time. There were initial reports that the waves of attacks would be for 12 hours, but they were actually for 5 hours. And there were three waves of attacks. The first wave centered on the anti-air systems of Iran. The next two waves combined attacks on research centers, drone centers, and it looks to me like the center of gravity was the missile production infrastructure of the Islamic Republic. One thing that was very interesting about this attack was that it was made public. The Israeli MO is to deny these attacks in order to give scope for deniability. In this case, Israel confirmed through the IDF spokesperson and other channels that this was an Israeli attack, and therefore they were taking ownership of it, and that's also a message for deterrence. Now, one of the most optimistic elements in this attack from the Israeli perspective is what happened with the Iranian anti-air installations. So, as I said, the first wave targeted the anti-air installations. From what I've heard from several sources, a few S-3000 systems were destroyed. Those are Russian anti-air systems and very hard to replace. Russia needs them right now in order to fight against Ukraine. But maybe more importantly, the systems proved to be not particularly effective. Even before they were shot down, remember, Israel managed to strike inside Iran already before. Nothing was shot down. I saw some video recorded by Iranians of their initial response, and it doesn't look like those systems are all that effective. But Israel destroyed a bunch of them anyway. That means that Iran is much more vulnerable to a counterattack. So the point of it wasn't just to make the next waves more safe, although that was certainly a point, but more importantly, to make it more difficult to defend from further attacks and to show Iran that they're vulnerable. That was a big success. Now, there's some controversy over how much damage the attack made to the ballistic production systems. Some IDF sources are saying that the production was taken back by several years. Other IDF sources are saying that it was taken back by several months. Of course, pro-Iranian sources are saying there was no significant damage at all. I guess we will have to see. But from what I'm seeing, that was the major, aside from the anti-air batteries, that was the major target. And there was an attempt to do actual damage to it, not just symbolic damage to it. There was damage to the drone program as well, and there was damage to research capabilities, but I'm not hearing that that was as effective or that that was as much of a focus of of the attack. Barak Ravid, he reported that one of the main things that Israel managed to destroy, perhaps the most important, aside from the anti-air batteries, there are 12 planetary mixers, which are a critical component in Iran's ballistic missile program. They're sold custom-made from China, and it takes at least a year to replace them, to produce and install on the in the capacity that Iran had. So that is one of the major reasons is the IDF thinks that there's been a setback to the missile program. Um, the ease with which the attack was executed, again, not the first time, was also a message to Iran. No planes were lost, which is a sign of success. And by all accounts, Israel didn't kill any civilians despite making a significant military blow, which is also something um, quite serious. Even though there's an element here, Israel took ownership and all that of psychological warfare, and there was also use of new, more sophisticated methods. I hear from the Israeli Air Force methods that are still classified. All that to send a psychological message. This attack was more substantive than anything else. If some people thought they might flatten the, say, IRGC headquarters or leadership infrastructure or something like that to send a psychological message, this was substantive. The idea was to set back the missile program and the anti-air program. Um, and the attack also makes it harder for Iran to respond. So if the missile production is curtailed, it's also harder for Iran to respond. And this is also forward-looking at future escalatory responses, right? This is already the third. So um, what happens when there's a fifth or a sixth or a seventh. If the missile capacity is diminished, it makes it less likely that Iran has even the capability to respond. And they're showing that every response in this war of attrition will see Iran be at a lower level of its ability to respond. And talking about Israel taking responsibility for it, um, there are many elements in Israel that would like this attack to have been stronger. If you remember, after a previous attack, Itamar Ben-Gvir, the internal security minister, mocked the first attack and said it was a minor attack. He called it a daldale, which is a Israeli sort of soccer term for a bad kick. This time, he said something a little bit different. He said it's an opening salvo for hitting the strategic assets in Iran. So I'm also hearing this from some sources in the IDF that they're looking at this as most likely a step to a bigger attack. And we'll talk a little bit about the political and diplomatic dimensions of that as well. One of the major reasons that this attack was relatively minor, we all know, is because of the Biden administration. The the U.S. has um, asked for a restrained attack for various reasons. Those reasons include the elections that are coming up. The biggest fear that the U.S. had regarding this attack from a political standpoint is that the price of oil would go up, especially if there's an attack in the refineries, but also if there's an attack on the nuclear program. And that would happen right before the elections, elections being, of course, very close. That could tip it over in favor of Trump. On a diplomatic level, the United States is trying to negotiate a ceasefire, both in Doha, where talks are starting again tomorrow, and currently trying to negotiate a ceasefire in Lebanon through envoy Amos Hochstein. And the last thing that they want now is an escalation to derail that. From the perspective of this administration, they only have a couple more months to succeed with this. And so that's on the diplomatic level. So because a lot of people are looking at this as a middle attack, an attack that is part of a ongoing campaign, the attempt to look at how deeply this has harmed the Islamic Republic is a little misleading. Tamir Haiman of the INSS at Tel Aviv University, former head of military intelligence, said the following. There's no point in giving grades to the attack. This is part of a wider campaign and should be examined in the context of the wider campaign. It's an operation that sets the table for the next operations, end quote. And that's actually not that different from what Ben-Gvir said, a little bit more sophisticated strategy talk, that this attack is seen as a bridge towards further operations should they be necessary. And keep in mind that next time this happens, if it happens, it will be after the elections. And that means that the restraints that Israel has on it right now from the United States could be gone. Um, it will be less pressing for Harris to repress an Israeli attack if she wins. And of course, with Trump, it's a very different ballgame. We don't exactly know what Trump will do regarding Iran. He's very unpredictable, but he's certainly going to have a completely different approach. So the restraints that Biden is putting on Israel are irrelevant. Um, Early on in the electoral cycle, Netanyahu was staying out of the elections. It looked like he had learned his lesson from his involvement in supporting Mitt Romney against Obama and then Romney losing and him paying a price with that with Obama and America domestically. But now, with the polls tightening and Biden not running, it looks like Netanyahu has changed that policy somewhat. He's, by all accounts, talking to Trump. He's, by all accounts, rooting for Trump to win. Sources close to him have told Israeli media that they want Trump to win, believe Trump will win. If Trump wins, they'll be able to wage a more unrestrained policy against Iran. And they also believe that that helps with deterrence against Iran. So what we need to think about is the wider campaign, the wider strategy, not this particular operation, but how it fits in it wider. And there are two major elements in how it fits in. One is the tit for tat with Iran, the direct war with Iran. That's changed the strategic framing of this entire conflict. Iran has always been fighting Israel through proxies. Now it's fighting Israel increasingly directly. That gives Israel the ability to pressure Iran directly and make it pay a price. And that's good because before Israel was paying a price and Iran's not paying a price. But we also have to be careful. What does it mean for Iran to pay a price? We're trying to get Iran to pay a price from the Israeli perspective in order to achieve something, in order to achieve a um, political, diplomatic deal in Gaza, in Lebanon, stability in the West Bank through them. We're not trying to destroy all of Iran. Israel doesn't have that capability. It's not an attempt at regime change. Israel doesn't have that capability. The attempt here is to move Iran towards a settlement that favors Israel. An endless war of attrition does not favor Israel. Israeli economy, Israeli IDF reserves, reputation in the world. So it's a delicate balance. Deterring Iran, pressuring Iran into a pro-Israeli deal without escalating endlessly into a war that ultimately will not favor Israel. The attack as it currently stands is good for pursuing that more reasonable goal. But of course, voices like Ben-Gvir and others raise the concern of continued escalation, which would be very harmful to Israel and to the entire region. So it's important to remember what the Israeli strategic goal is to end this thing quickly in the most favorable terms possible. This attack allows that process to continue. The next steps will be crucial. Okay, so I had a couple of questions from you guys. It's been over a week since I did my last video. Thank you to everyone who watched the video and commented. Ariel Shalev asks, "What are your thoughts on the general's plan recommended by your island? How will Israel beat Hamas without the ability to separate between civilians and terrorists in North Gaza?" So the general's plan, as put forth by Ireland, is a very controversial one. It involves laying siege on city after city and starving the terrorists there to death. Basically, taking it over and beginning to distribute the humanitarian aid. The U.S. administration has made it very clear that it believes that that constitutes a war crime. Um, the question is, can Israel reliably separate the um, civilians and get them out of the cities from Hamas? Will it be starving civilians to death as part of this plan? That would constitute a war crime by any measure. Um, I think what's good about the island plan is the idea of replacing the infrastructure for delivering aid in Gaza, which I continue to see as what is propping Hamas up and allowing them to continue the war. What I don't like about it is the possibility of um, starving innocent civilians to death. So I think what Israel needs to do is figure out a plan of taking over all of Gaza, distributing aid, all with minimal casualties for civilians. And of course, as I've said here from the day one of this channel, replacing it with a legitimate Palestinian government over time. Whatever idea of control there has to be temporary. So I like Island's idea of replacing Hamas's distribution mechanisms. I don't like the very brutal elements of siege, which sound frankly medieval to me. Gary Clark asked, and I got this question like in three different variations after the assassination of Sinwar. So I'm also answering the rest of you. Have you ever considered that around the world people are very angry with Israel for the 40,000 plus Gazans slaughtered, may seek revenge? Yes, yes, I consider that all the time. Um, that is one of the downsides of the forever war model that it almost looks to me like Israel is adopting right now, is that, of course, it replenishes the number of people supporting attacks against Israel and willing to execute attacks against people. What a lot of people are not understanding about what's happening in Gaza now, on the pro-Israeli side, is that Israel is creating a very fertile place, um, breeding ground for further recruitments for Hamas. There's no jobs in Gaza, and there's a lot of people being killed. So you're creating so many people who have a personal vendetta against Israel and people who can't get another job aside from working for Hamas. So Hamas is going to have no problem recruiting people. Their only issue will be getting in weapons, and getting in weapons is not as hard as people think. So that's why it's very difficult to destroy Hamas this way. It's not just Hamas. I think that what Gary is saying is that there will be other organizations, other people from around the world who will want to commit attacks against Israel. And that is absolutely why my consistent position has been that this war needs to be fought in such a manner that it leads to a diplomatic solution which stops the conflict and tries to prevent the next conflict. Um, if Israel wins this war, quote unquote, just militarily, or more likely it reaches some kind of military stalemate, it's just a matter of time till the next round. In the next round, there'll be so much motivation against Israel because so many people have died. That's why it's important to create a better future and to stop this. So I think about that all the time. But on the other hand, that doesn't mean Israel can just stop fighting, because if Israel just stops fighting without reaching any kind of diplomatic solution, Hamas remains in power in Gaza, Hezbollah remains on the border in Lebanon, and then also the next round is just a matter of time. So that's why the emphasis needs to be on a diplomatic resolution. Okay, so that's the end of our episode. Thank you so much for joining me. If you like what I do here, consider supporting me on Patreon. at Shale Media and listening to my podcast, The History of the Land of Israel podcast, where I'm currently discussing the Israelite kingdom of Israel. I'll see you here next time. Something interesting